They said it couldn't be solved. It couldn't be fixed. It was a wasted system, the end for the BBC as we know it going forward. Well, maybe, just maybe, what if they found a solution? Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter.
Picked up a spout. Still a good mile and a half or so ahead of us here. What we're seeing is a visible spout.
Hold on a minute.
Good evening, sir. TV licensing.
I haven't got a television. Oh, that's for dinner. Chicken.
Nice hat.
A TV licence works out at less than £9 a month. Is it really worth trying to avoid it?
Hi there guys, it's Adam Martin here, and welcome back to another video, and this time we're going to be discussing once again the licence fee, the controversial TV licence fee that it seems many would rather do away with than keep. And I think if you're familiar with this topic, you'll know for a fact that this has been an ongoing issue for several years about how do we adapt the BBC licence fee for the future, because quite frankly, with how it is addressed now, just sort of a blanket payment for everybody, it hasn't quite worked for everyone, let's say that. But as the BBC changes in the future, and with talks about the licence fee being abolished in its current form, one thing that no one, at least in the BBC itself or the ruling governments of the day, have been able to successfully put forward is how do we adapt it? How do we change it? How do we make it work for everybody? Well, recently I came across an article on RXTV. As always, go and check them out for great media-related articles, which talks about that a replacement may well have been found and be linked to council tax. Now, this might already raise some potential eyebrows amongst some of you, but let's read through this article first, see what it has to say, and go from there. It says that BBC chairman Samir Shah revealed in a Sunday Times interview that he favours a new funding option for the public broadcaster that will see households pay different amounts for the BBC depending on their circumstances. In his first major interview since taking over from Richard Sharp, who left the BBC in 2023, Shah dismissed alternative options to replace the licence fee after 2027. The government is currently reviewing how the BBC is paid for, as record numbers of people stop paying and do without BBC services. It follows 15 years of cuts for the broadcaster, very true, which has seen it lose shows and sporting events to rivals. It's also cut back on services to UK audiences, as it balances funding for international services. The current funding arrangement is linked to the BBC Royal Charter, which expires in December 2027, and this whole thing about international services getting a lot more attention, some would say, than British services. I think it's not just a case of cutting back international stuff entirely. We have talked about this before in videos related to the World Service and stuff like that, but I think personally, as a Brit, I think it is quite important that the BBC maintains a presence on an international front, especially as we continue to dive into this world heavily based on misinformation. We have AI generating false things now, so I think, to be honest, more than ever, we need the BBC to have a presence in areas of the world where reliable news just isn't an option. Shah dismissed alternative funding models, including advertising and a Netflix-style subscription. Advertising on the BBC would kill off ITV, he said. Now, just for a disclaimer, what I believe he means by that is that in terms of competition, ITV wouldn't be able to compete. I don't think he's saying that as a boastful thing, we'd kill off ITV if we got commercials, because let's be honest, if that was the case, they probably would have done it by now. But there's only a certain amount, of advertising that gets sold, essentially, and in that commercial television world, yes, there's several commercial channels, but the big, the big bulk of it, the big advertisers, let's face it, it goes to the elder statesmen, the bigger broadcasters, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, they're like the main ones. If the BBC entered that ring, it would be bad pretty much for everyone involved, because you're adding another big name, a big brand that will soak up a lot of advertising because they know of the viewership they're going to get, and that's just going to make things worse for the other commercial channels in terms of advertising revenue, and worse for the BBC if it went down that route as well. Meanwhile, a subscription would not meet the BBC's key role to offer something for everybody in the country. It's interesting he says that, because a subscription makes it more, optional optional for the viewer. And I guess that does conflict with the BBC's core, or one of its core values, that it has to provide to everyone, or at least to the best of its ability. But what if that everyone includes people who aren't interested in what you put out or just can't afford the subscription? He also dismissed a hybrid license fee, which was quite a popular alternative suggested, which would see the BBC provide a basic service, including news, for free, and then other content, like drama, would be subject to a premium. Now, like I said, this was a popular thing I saw floating around the internet, people saying, well, keep the core services like BBC News, for example, make that free. Everything else, people can pay for it if they want it. Whilst I think that might sound like a good idea on paper, I think from the BBC's perspective, that's not a sustainable model. Funding through general taxation, suggested in January, would leave the BBC open to influence from the government of the day, and the BBC has always throughout its life tried to very much maintain distant from the governments of the day. It doesn't bow down to governmental influences. In fact, look across its history, and it has always, when it had to be, it can be critical. It can interrogate governments of the day no matter what their political colour. So in terms of the replacement options as it stands, here's a little breakdown. The government has 2 years to decide how the BBC will be funded after the current Royal Charter ends, which is at the end of 2027, I believe. Multiple alternative options for the TV licence fee are on the table. In January, sources close to the culture sec, Lisa Nandy, floated the idea of funding the BBC through general taxation, and like we just said, that was shot down. Previously, there had been calls to make the BBC a hybrid, as we've said, with that free provision, and some become subscription only, and like I said, I don't think that's going to work. And if all other options lead to a dead end, the BBC licence fee just could be retained as it is, similar to how it's ended up in the Republic of Ireland, as they have a licence fee as well. The problem with that is, and it's always been this default thing over the last few years when discussion of the licence fee has come up, it's always been this thing of, well, after all this discussion, after all this debate, we just can't find an alternative. Why don't we just keep it as it is? Let's keep things the same. Don't disrupt the status quo, that sort of thing. And whilst that, again, it might work well in the short term, it's really not good for the long term, because the license fee has been, let's be honest, it's been bleeding numbers these past few years. I think there was a figure, wasn't it, in the last year, there was a drop of 500,000 people. Now, when you consider how many Brits there are in the country, that might not sound like much, but that will be devastating in terms of an income provision for the Beeb. So yes, they could just retain it, but that's not even going to help in the long run.
Every day, TV licensing watch Impressionists.
Is it the TV licence? I can't help you. I'm just the odd job man.
Hi, darling, I'm home.
Why risk it? With every address on our computer, you could be watching horror.
Get a TV licence. It's cheaper than a big fine.
Shah told the Sunday Times any future funding of the BBC should be dependent on the household. He argued, why should people who are poor pay the same as people in wealthy households? Now, this argument has been, around about a whole manner of things, including, things regarding tax generally, just other parts of life where people argue the wealthy should pay more because they have more. Council tax bands or income tax bands could be used to create a sliding scale, with homeowners in the highest bands paying more. If, based on council tax bands, the new fee could be collected alongside council tax as part of the new household levy. Households would be unlikely to have the option to opt out of the BBC element of the combined bill. Now, this would, I guess, be largely the big controversy that, say, obviously, council tax depends on partly where you live in the UK and on the band that you're in. Let's just say, a hypothetical situation, right? Say you pay roughly £150 a month in council tax, okay? Roughly a month. With the BBC, which currently license fee stands, let's just average it out, make it solid numbers. Say it's 170. So you've got to divide that by 12, and then that would come in your monthly council tax bill, if that's how you pay for it. So I guess, doing a bit of quick maths, that's going to add an extra 12, 13, 14 pounds onto your council tax. I guess where people might kick off is that if they argue they don't want access to any BBC service, or, they don't need it, they don't use it, etc., if it's included with council tax, they're not going to have a choice. Speaking in favour of such a levy, Shah said it gets rid of the enforcement issue, which is a problem. The idea that not paying the licence fee is a criminal offence seems too harsh. Now, the stance is similar to that of the ex-chairman, Richard Sharp, who also favoured a sliding scale system based on a household's ability to pay. So this old idea is now back on the cards, it seems. And the whole criminal offence, enforcing the licence fee issue, this has been the big sticking point about it for decades now. The license fee goons, as they're called, come into your house saying, do you have a TV? Do you pay a TV license? And some people facing prosecution and all that. So, but when he says it gets rid of the enforcement issue, I mean, in terms of people deliberately coming up to your doors for the TV license alone, maybe, but could you argue it is still a kind of enforcement if you're including it within council tax, a tax that we all have to pay, otherwise we can face real serious repercussions? Isn't that enforcement of a different kind? The article does point out that it's unlikely evasion would just disappear altogether because some households have tried to evade council tax, and that's true, but I think the evasion, to my knowledge, the evasion might be a bit more difficult to do than compared to this license fee one that exists now. So in terms of a household levy then, if it went down this council tax route, this supposed solution, what does this mean? Well, adding the cost of the BBC to a council tax bill would see the total bill increase substantially. However, the overall extra cost to a household would be cancelled out by no longer having to pay a separate licence fee. The biggest losers would be households who have previously opted out of paying for a TV licence. People living in bigger, more expensive homes would also pay more. People in homes in a low council tax banding could end up paying less. So it's back to this, those who often have more money or more wealth say, why should I pay more? Just because I have more, that's often an argument that gets thrown about there. And yeah, people who opt out of a TV license will essentially have no choice. If it's levied in as part of council tax, for example, then they'll have to pay it whether they use BBC services or not. I'll give my personal thoughts on this whole idea in a bit, but I just want to finish off this article first. Opt-outs wouldn't be possible in the same way homes can't opt out of the extra police, fire and social care costs added to a council tax bill. There is no council tax in Northern Ireland, which is and the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands. Here, different mechanisms would be needed, perhaps based on rateable values of property. So that's a whole other complex thing that would have to be thrown in there for those territories. Alternatively, if they used income tax bands, this would be more difficult to calculate. Because if it's linked to one individual in a household, you're going to expect the households to nominally transfer the bill to the lowest paid person to avoid paying more. So, if you earned, I don't know, like £30,000 a year, but the person you're living with earns £20,000 a year, you'd put the tax in a way onto that lowest person for like the license, if you will, because then you're going to pay less. So I don't think the income tax one is a likely scenario. I think if they're going to do a levy, some kind of household levy of any kind, it'd be via the council tax route, because that's not necessarily designated to an individual, that's for the household. They also mention about a tax on streamers. The BBC Director General, Tim Davie, and Samir Shah have favourably spoken about a tax on streamers. That's in addition to any replacement of the TV licence. Any tax could support the wider British film and TV industry, where multiple projects are reportedly stuck in limbo due to funding issues. Alternatively, in line with the system that funds Spain's public broadcaster, any tax could directly support the BBC, which could then spend money on supporting new UK-made TV projects. So in Spain, commercial TV and streaming services must pay a tax on revenues, which supports the public broadcaster RTVE. Now, this is a very interesting idea. Now, it seems to work for them over in Spain, and I think having your public broadcaster, your country's public broadcaster, in a state of good health, like financially as well, is a really good idea, because those public broadcasters are so important. They're so vital to every country's local industry, I'd argue. So in that case, you're sort of saying, would ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, all those other commercial channels that litter about Freeview, the streamers, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime Video, if they all contribute a tax, then that could also help the BBC's financial situation. It could help bolster it. You could argue if that happens, it might make the pressure of a license fee directly to the individual viewer become less. I'd argue that the average consumer, if you told them, listen, your TV license, whether it's part of a household levy or not, if your TV license could become less, as long as Netflix, Amazon, all of them lot pay, this tax themselves, would you do that? I think a lot of them would genuinely say, yeah, that sounds good. The only downside to that would be maybe to try and compensate that all these streamers might increase their prices. Now, they've all ran on subscription-based models, so I guess they just lose customers, but then that some would argue that by taxing the streamers in the UK, that whilst this might be a good idea again on paper, it might lead to long-term problems with both how, say, streamers continue their financial operations here in this country, what it means for the BBC, what it means for the consumer in all aspects. It might just end up being one of those things that gets bandied about, discussed for ages, and then nothing actually happens.
The ref in the World Cup. Oh, he did, didn't he? That was appalling.
With our new handheld TV detectors, everyone without a TV license is within our reach. This helps us catch over 1,000 people a day.
In comments to the Sunday Times, Shah refused to be drawn on how much any potential tax on streamers should be. Well, because, I mean, how do you do that? How do you tax the streamers? Do they all get taxed the same amount, depending? Or is it like the council tax thing, but in a streaming form? Depending on how big their bank balances are, do you tax them more? It's really, again, this is all seemingly preliminary ideas, and it has seemingly worked over in Spain, so why can't it work over here if it's done with some care and thought? So my personal thoughts on this, I mean, with the council tax levy, does it balance out? I mean, you don't have to pay your annual fee anymore for the license, but it's going to be bundled into your council tax. As someone who supports the BBC generally, I'll always be critical of them if I need to be, but I support the idea of the BBC, what it is as our public broadcaster. I still maintain it's one of our best exports around the world. It's something we as Brits are highly regarded for around the world. Not a perfect organisation by any means. I think we've seen that time and time again, but I do think it's equally important that it survives, that it continues to go on doing the work it's doing. So for me personally as a consumer, if this did get lumped in with my council tax bill, provided that, you know, I knew how much exactly this was being added to the bill and if I could work it all out, then I'm more than happy to contribute in that way. But I think, to be honest, no matter what they choose, right, come 2027, when the current license fee ends, whether they retain it, whether they swap to this household levy, whether they do something else, not everyone is going to be happy. This is just one of those situations where you aren't going to satisfy everybody involved. Because how can you? If you go with this idea of, you know, the rich pay more, I'm sure some in the upper class would probably be happy to do that, but there's going to be an equal amount who will, as I said, come out the woodwork and say, why should I have to pay more just because I earn more and da-da-da-da-da. Like, do you know what I mean? It isn't really a win-win situation for anybody. But out of all of the main options put forward, again, personally, in my opinion, you know, outside of just retaining the license fee as it is, I do think in terms of the BBC's, like, financial future and its security, going down a household levy route like linked with council tax is probably the best alternative that's been touted so far. Like I said, the hybrid one sounded nice but doesn't really work in practice. Subscription just wouldn't work for them entirely. And I'm talking about, you know, them as a business, as a brand. I know different consumers. You might even say to me, Adam, I prefer it to just be outright subscription. And that's totally valid. But I think for them as an organization, as a corporation, this levy idea is probably the most reliable outlet they've got right now. As to whether it'll happen or not, well, we'll just have to wait and see. We've got at least 2 more years of the license fee as it is, and it is going up in April, of course, to £174.50, which I know not a lot of people are happy about. Believe me, I'm not either. No one likes to see things going up. But we'll see if this council tax, you know, link happens in 2 years' time. But I mean, that is all for this video in general. I want to know your thoughts, though. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you think the household levy option is a good idea for the future of the BBC, the license fee and all that? Or do you think one of the other alternative methods that have been suggested would work better? Let me know all of your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. In the meantime, if you're new here, do subscribe to us as well, because we'd love to have you aboard. The support you've been giving the channel has been immense recently, especially on some of the more like little mini documentaries I've been doing on like BBC Select, the 390 services, the other ones like Prime, Knowledge and Choice, all that sort of stuff. It's been really great, so do keep supporting the channel. You've been wonderful. But in the meantime, I've been Adam Martin from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.
Yes, there's a TV set on number 5. It's in the front room. And they're watching Colombo.
If you don't have a TV license, it won't take us long to find you.
Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Shaun Knock, Daud Khan, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Ajmac 200017, Deck, Jen, Traffy, Evanhart 41 Radio, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Marnanel Thurman, John Wakefield, 40-something Manchild, Jerry Ralph, John McLeod, James Wallace, Ben, Kat Hegarty, Stephen Oliver, Tegan, Shadowfiend 180X, Swan Ronson, Adam Gamer, Fonzie Daz, Real Random, Seraphic Euphoria, and John, our AMTV staff members.